Second section of Chapter 1. Later those involved, especially Jane, would remember that moment when everything went wrong and how events developed very rapidly in those dizzying days. With mastery, Thomas Northrop devoted himself to seducing Lady Jane Roach, looking for every opportunity to be alone with her, and whisper sweet and flattering words in her ear. The innocent adolescent felt in love for the first time and believed that this would be the great love spoken of in the romantic novels that she liked to read. In the middle of one of the picnics that were organized to celebrate the days of hunting, Thomas was observing in the distance to Jane, who was talking with other young women, and every time that their glances crossed, Jane smiled enchanted and blushed, while he smiled with malice and saw her with lasciviousness, like a wolf to his prey. Thomas did not realize that his uncle approached him. "It seems you cannot stop seeing Lady Jane, right?" Mr. Pemberton said in a stern voice and an ironic gesture on his face. "Really? I had not realized. It must be your imagination, uncle," Thomas replied uncomfortably and with annoyance, and he turned his gaze away from Jane, but not daring to see his uncle. "No, unfortunately, it's not my imagination, Thomas. I'll be old but I'm not stupid, Thomas, and I hate when someone thinks I am." "Stay away from the Marquis's daughter," said Mr. Pemberton more serious, with an intimidating look. "I repeat that they are only your imaginations. Now if you do allow me, uncle," Thomas said annoyed and tried to leave, but Pemberton grabbed him by the arm. "Don't you dare leave me with the word in my mouth," Mr. Pemberton exclaimed furiously and raising his voice, but seeing that other guests who were nearby turned to see them, lowered the tone of the voice and released his nephew, but saw him with anger. "I've had enough of your stupid things. You are no longer a child. If I have given you a chance to straighten out your life, it is only because you are my sister's son and I promised her to take care of you. But my patience has a limit and a misguided sheep can exhaust patience, the most patient of the shepherds. What happens with you? Is not it enough the daughters of poor peasants and the maids who you have seduced, the women who cheat their husbands with you, or the whores you pay with my money? You must also try to steal the virtue of a maiden from an honorable family, an innocent girl," Pemberton added indignantly. "I'm not to blame if she wants to give it to me," Thomas answered softly and cynically. "You're a..." Pemberton said furiously, holding his nephew by the arm while he clenched the fist of his free hand as if he wanted to hit him. "You are unworthy of the mother you had. Listen to me, scoundrel, because I'm going to tell you very seriously. I intend to do a great business with the Marquis, a business that can help my bank a lot, and if everything goes well that will also help me open the doors of other friends aristocrats of the Marquis. But if you offend the honor of this house that has so generously opened its doors to us, if you manage to offend the Marquis, not only will I lose that opportunity, but also the enmity of such a powerful man in the region as him. It can close many doors me and take me to ruin, and if that happens, I swear by the memory of your mother, my dear sister, that I will turn my back on you, and never again in life will you have a penny of me or any help, even if I see you asking alms in the street. I would never have brought you if I had known that the Marquis had a daughter so beautiful you were going to fix on, and because in my stupidity I wanted to believe in your promises of having rectified your conduct. But if you touch a hair of the girl, if you dishonor her, you and me will have finished, and I do not care if the Marquis does not know, even if only I know it. So hide well that misery between your legs and wait for us to get out of here so you can run to the nearest brothel to vent. I'll be watching you more closely, and I do not want to see you too close to Lady Jenna. Is that clear?" Pemberton added in a threatening tone. "I do not need to be threatened by you, uncle," said Thomas, energetically pushing his arm away from his uncle's hand. "I know very well what I owe you, and I will not disappoint you. I swear to you for my mother that I will get away from Lady Jane," he added seriously. "I hope so," exclaimed Mr. Pemberton. Of course, Thomas did not fulfill his promise. Time later, that day, he managed to take Jane to a hidden corner of the mansion, and there he kissed her passionately. He whispered sweet, romantic words in her ear, the kind of words often found in romantic novels that young, naive and dreamy women like Lady Jane read. the kind of rehearsed discourse Thomas used with his most innocent praise. Listening to him, Jane thought she was in one of those novels and really believed it was true when Thomas swore sincere and eternal love, when he swore to her that in his life he had never felt such a violent and sudden passion for a woman, that it was pure love at first sight. The man knew how to flatter the girl's self-esteem, how to make her feel special, and that's how he led her to the path of perdition. "Oh, my love, my sweet girl, how I love you," said the scoundrel while he kept kissing her on the neck and on the lips. "I love you too, Thomas. You must talk to my father to ask for my hand," Jane replied enthusiastically. "I would like to do it, my beloved, but your father will never accept to give your hand in marriage to an honest man, but without money like me, without a fortune. Your father will see me as someone unworthy for his daughter, even as a probable fortune hunter, a scoundrel," Thomas lied cynically. "But if your uncle talks with my father, I think," Jane said anxiously. "My uncle will not. I'm ashamed to have to say it, but my uncle is not the good man that looks. He has been very hard and unfair to me. He has never loved me and has only taken care of me for a debt of honor with my deceased parents, but in return, he has forced me to work as a slave for him, but he hates me, he sees me as a hindrance," Thomas replied in a false tone of apologetic. "Oh, my love, poor you. But if we both talk to my father?" Jane answered. "No, from what I've heard your father is quite hard and very rigid, is not it?" said Thomas. Jane answered affirmatively, and then tears ran down her cheeks, for she became sad like the maidens starring her novels when the obstacles stood between her and her beloved. She ducked her head, but Thomas put a finger under her chin and lifted her head. "But all is not lost, our love can still triumph, but you must trust me, will you?" Thomas asked. "Of course," Jane exclaimed, recovering the joy. "Then you must wait for me tonight." "I will visit you in your bedroom," Thomas said softly. "In my bedroom?" exclaimed Jane, horrified and scandalized. "Yes, but do not worry about, my love. I know it is not the right thing to do, it is not appropriate, but you must believe me, my intentions are honest. I want to spend the rest of my life with you, but for that we must take risks, we must do things that otherwise we would not do, if there were not so many enemies of our love," said Thomas with apparent seriousness and sincerity, although inside, he wanted mock of the silly naivety of girl. While Thomas continued to convince Jane with his deceitful and hypocritical speech, in another part of the property a newcomer to the meeting of those days was in front of the Marquis. It was the eldest son and heir of the Marquis, an older brother of Jane, Henry, a man quite physically similar to his father, but obviously in a young version. He was 40 years old, well taken, he was relatively tall and stocky, with a pleasant and manly face. "I'm sorry I joined the celebration late, father, but the ship was delayed a couple of days in arriving, respect to the predicted thing, and I had to supervise the disembarkation with delay, and later the ways were impassable," Henry excused himself seriously. "Don't worry, son, have you seen your wife?" replied the Marquis, more or less kind to his son. "Yes, I already greeted her, and my mother too. Have you seen little Jane?" Henry said, relaxing the voice at the end. "Over there she must walk, you know that your sister is like a puppy, especially at a party, running from one corner to another," replied the Marquis in a mocking tone. But Henry's attention was diverted to the face of a servant, a thin young man smiling at him, and Henry also smiled faintly. A while later Henry was talking animatedly with his favorite sister, Jane. "I see you very happy, my little squirrel," Henry said, cheerful, with a broad smile. "I do not know, my dear brother. Maybe I'll have happy news for the family soon," Jane replied with a charming smile. "Really? Do not tell me someone wants to ask for your hand in marriage," scoffed Henry mockingly. Jane blushed and ducked her head with a nervous little giggle. "It must be a joke. Who is the suitor?" Henry asked incredulously and anxiously. "Do not hurry, Henry. When, when it's something definitive you'll be the first to know," said Jane, laughing and nervous. "For him to marry my little squirrel he will need my approval. Must be someone good enough to be worthy of my sister," said Henry, smiling, but speaking seriously and with a certain warning tone. "Don't be overprotective, Henry. In any case, when I get married, I want to be as happy in my marriage as you have been in yours," Jane replied happily, looking affectionately at her older brother. "Yes, of course," Henry answered with a hint of sadness on his face and something else, shame. From a distance, Thomas saw Jane talking to his brother, both laughing, and as he looked at Jane with a lustful gaze, he smiled wickedly. The hours passed and the time came when everyone retired to their respective bedrooms to sleep, and not long after Thomas walked with a candle lamp in one hand the long corridors in the direction of one wing of the house to the other, searching Jane's bedroom, following the instructions she had given him, after many pleas, promises and sweet words from him. The man walked slowly, cautiously, trying not to make noise, and sharpening his eyes to detect anyone who crossed his path and could see him. He was dressed only in a nightshirt and a house robe, over his shirt, closed with a tie tied at the waist, and slippers. When Thomas was approaching Jane's bedroom door, he thought he heard a noise and turned to see where it came from. He stood still for a moment, trying to see or hear something, but after convincing himself that there was no one else in the corridor, he resumed his walk and at last put his hand on the door handle and entered Jane's bedroom. But Thomas had not really been wrong, there was someone who had observed him. It was the young servant who had smiled at Henry when he greeted his father. The young man also walked through the corridors with a lamp and was almost going to pass by, when he glanced at another person, a silhouette illuminated by the light of a candle in the darkness. He quickly hid behind a corner that connected to another hallway and quietly spied on Thomas. And so he watched as the man scrutinized the corridor looking for other people, and as after ascertaining that he was apparently alone, he walked a few more steps and entered Jane's bedroom. The young man made a gesture of surprise and scandal on his face, which almost immediately became a gesture of concern, frowning, and then he hurried to walk quickly, almost running, in the direction of another bedroom. Inside the bedroom, Jane was dressed in a nightgown and a robe over it, and she was barefoot. Having reluctantly consented to Thomas's desire to visit her in her bedroom at night, something that was absolutely indecent according to the education they had given her and the norms of society, she expected very nervously, frightened and repentant. She had many doubts, and she was asking herself if she was doing the right thing, if her sudden passion for Thomas was blinding her. Her conscience was screaming at her that she was doing something infamous, mean, indecent, and her brain told her that she was also committing stupidity, that she was looking for her own ruin. But then she remembered the handsome face of Thomas, how handsome he was, and the words he had told her, the kisses and caresses he had given her, and she felt again the illusion of the love, of first love, and of a hot in her body that she could not identify. But still, she doubted, she was afraid of what might happen that night, and especially of the consequences, and feared her father's anger. Suddenly the idea of risking everything for a lover and even running away with him, if that were the case, did not seem so romantic and idealistic. She even felt the desire to run away from her bedroom, to take refuge in her mother's bedroom with some excuse, or to hide in some corner and then ask Thomas for forgiveness. Surely he would understand because he was so sweet. But she did not decide to do it, and then the door opened and Jane jumped in fright, while her heart accelerated. At first, Thomas dissipated her fears and doubts, behaving loving and sweet, seducing her with his words and caresses. Jane was once again seduced, in love, even though Thomas's breath smelled a lot like alcohol, but she supposed it was normal for all the gentlemen. After all, her own father overindulged with drinking sometimes. But soon he became more impatient and demanding, given the girl's reluctance and doubts, and forced her to lie down in bed. Meanwhile, the young servant came to a bedroom and after checking that no one saw him, opened the door and entered. Inside was Henry, Jane's brother, wearing pants and a shirt that he wore with sleeves rolled up and chest open. He was having a drink when he heard the servant open the door and turned to see him. "You are late," I thought you were not coming," Henry said with a smile as he approached the servant. "Henry, a man has entered your sister's bedroom," said the anguished young man. "What?" Henry exclaimed, and a gesture of anger and concern covered his face. "I just saw him when I was walking to here. I think it's that presumptuous and unbearable man, the banker's nephew, of Mr. Pemberton," the nervous young man replied. "Damn bastard!" Henry exclaimed furiously, pushing the servant away, and he went out into the corridor as if he were a hurricane of pure rage. In her bedroom, Jane was having a hard time. Thomas had made her take off her robe, and now she was lying on the bed on her back, dressed only in her long nightgown. He had taken off his own robe and had only his nightshirt. Thomas grabbed Jane's nightgown for curbstone and tried to pull it up to reveal Jane's intimacy in her crotch. "No, Thomas, please. I do not want to." "We must wait," said Jane, anguished, embarrassed, with tears in her eyes. "Stay calm, my love. You'll like it. At first, it's going to hurt, but then you'll like it," said Thomas with an obscene laugh. "No, please, stop," Jane begged. But brusquely Thomas get up her nightgown, leaving naked the crotch of Jane. She instinctively closed her legs, but he with his hands and his superior strength forced her to open them, and he watched with lust Jane's vagina covered with a thick bush of black pubic hair. "What a delight! How I'm going to enjoy breaking it! How goodwill to see mine inside!" exclaimed morbid Thomas, as he pulled up his own nightshirt to show his erect virile member. "No!" Jane exclaimed, frightened to see for the first time in her life a cock of an adult man and also erect, and seeing her most intimate part exposed. "Please, Thomas. I do not want. Go away. Stupid girl, now you cannot regret it. Do you think you are going to leave me hot without satisfying me? Stay still or I'll do you more harm than necessary," Thomas said threateningly, speaking as a different man, one wicked and cruel. "No, help!" Jane shouted, but Thomas covered to her the mouth with one hand. "Shut up, you damn fool! Keep your screams for when I make you bleed like a sow," Thomas exclaimed with anger and sadism, and while he kept covering the mouth of Jane with one hand he introduced one of the fingers of the other hand inside her, making her open her eyes a lot and utter a choked scream by the hand of Thomas. Thomas was settling in the right position to penetrate Jane, but at that moment the door slammed open and Henry stormed into the bedroom. Before Thomas could react, Henry punched him brutally in the face and threw him out of Jane's bed with the impact, knocking him to the ground. Henry turned around and saw Jane briefly, her nightgown up revealing her naked crotch and crying in shock, saw how she saw him and dropped her nightgown with modesty, and saw the pain and shame in the innocent and sweet eyes of his little sister, and he felt that he lost his reason. In a fit of rage he kicked Thomas's head as he tried to get up, and when the man fell back to the ground, he stomped too hard on his face. Then he straddled him and began to beat him brutally in the face with his fist clenched, breaking his nose and mouth, making him bleed. In that Thomas was not wrong. In the end, someone bled like a pig. Henry kept hitting him like a madman as if possessed by a wicked spirit, and the other man was knocked unconscious, but Henry did not stop and kept hitting him. The servant who was with Henry came running into the bedroom and tried to hold him by the shoulders. "Enough, Henry! You're going to kill him!" exclaimed the desperate young man. But in response, Henry gave a brutal jostle with the elbow that broke the servant's mouth and threw him on his back. Henry kept hitting Thomas and the frightened servant staggered to his feet and ran for help. Jane screamed and cried hysterically, begging her brother to stop. In front the scandal and shouting, many guests had already awakened and began to leave their respective bedrooms and sleeve clothes. The young servant returned running with two other young servants, and between the three they grabbed Henry and with great effort pulled him away from Thomas, who was lying on the ground unconscious. In anguish, Jane saw several guests begin to swirl in front of her bedroom door, and her heart nearly burst out of her mouth when her father appeared at the door. "What the hell is happening here?" the Marquis shouted, worried and furious. A few minutes later there was a strong argument in the presence of the guests, in the hallway in front of the bedroom door, while the Marchioness hugged her daughter and comforted her while caressing her. The mother and daughter cried. Henry's wife surrounded her mother-in-law and sister-in-law with her arms, and she also cried. Thomas, who had already regained consciousness, was standing with his face full of blood and bruises, while two servants held him by the arms, as for him not to escape. Henry was in front of him, clenching his fists with anger and with the murderous look fixed on him, while the servant who had warned him remained at his side prepared to hold him. The Marquis shouted angrily and gesticulated with his cane, and Thomas's uncle, Mr. Pemberton, stood as pale as a dead man, he alternating looks of fear and shame directed at the Marquis, compassion directed at Jane and anger directed at his nephew. "How dare you, damn bastard! Try to force my daughter, in my own house!" exclaimed the threatening and angry Marquis. "I was not going to force her. She invited me to her bedroom," replied Thomas, scared and humiliated. Henry tried to throw himself at him, but the servant and a guest held him down, and the Marquis tried to hit him with his cane, but two guests held him back. "If I am guilty of something is to have courted her. You can accuse me of seducing her but not of trying to force her," Thomas exclaimed. "Damn liar! My daughter would never do something like that. She is a decent lady," the Marquis shouted. "All these days we have been talking all the time, every time we had an opportunity we talked alone, and she accepted my courtship with pleasure. With so many guests here many people must have realized, ask and you will see that several people will corroborate what I say," said Thomas a little challenging. There were murmurs among those present, and some women whispered with malicious glances about Jane. Henry turned around and caught sight of his sister's face, and what he saw did not like it. "Be ashamed! You try to defame my daughter!" the Marquis shouted, but with less conviction after having also seen the face of his daughter. "In these days she even gave me an embroidered handkerchief with her initials with a small note, 'If they take me to my bedroom I can show them where I kept it,'" said Thomas with vehemence as if he were defending himself in front of a court of justice. "Shut up, Thomas! You've done enough damage!" exclaimed Mr. Pemberton, embarrassed and with his voice broken by emotion, almost on the verge of crying. The Marquis turned to see Jane with an inquisitive and intimidating look. "Jane?" the Marquis asked in a voice full of tension and threat. "Father, maybe we should continue this discussion in private," Henry whispered, watching the guests around him. "The final evidence is how I got to her bedroom, in this big house, unknown to me. How did I find her bedroom at night if she did not tell me how to get there?" claimed Thomas. The murmurs increased, and now the Marquis saw his daughter with growing anger. "Jane," said the Marquis with a hard look. "Father," Henry begged. Jane was shaking like a scared fawn, without that her mother's loving arms on her shoulders mitigating the fear and embarrassment she felt. "Papa, forgive me, I thought," Jane began to say. But she could not continue because her father brutally slapped her and fell to the ground in the arms of her mother and sister-in-law, while her brother held her father. A trickle of blood flowed from Jane's broken lips, and the girl lost consciousness by nervous tension. A while later Mr. Pemberton was in front of the Marquis and Henry in the library of the mansion. "Once again I beg your pardon, my lord, if dying I could repair this offence, I would do it with pleasure," said Mr. Pemberton visibly moved and ashamed. "Lamentably your death cannot repair anything, in reality, there is nothing that can repair it, or is it that you going to offer a marriage with the scoundrel of your nephew to try to repair this unforgivable offence?" the Marquis exclaimed furiously. "Although if that could repair a small part of the damage caused, and even if I was not convinced that the worst damage your daughter could suffer is to marry my nephew's depraved scoundrel, I'm afraid that in any case, is not possible. Because my nephew is already married," said Pemberton almost ready to cry. The Marquis recoiled in shock and Henry went ahead scandalized. "What?" Henry exclaimed furiously. "Several years ago, when he was much younger, he seduced a poor innocent girl, the daughter of a doctor in his small hometown, and as a result, she was with child. The doctor was a prestigious man and an old friend of our family, so the families negotiated and forced my nephew to marry the girl, although it was necessary for the doctor to contribute a generous amount of money as a dowry to convince him. But unfortunately, Thomas has not behaved well with his wife and son, in fact already long since he separated from her, and I am the one who takes charge of financially helping the girl and the boy. But, they continue married, too, although that does not matter to him, said Mr. Pemberton. And that scoundrel talked to her about love and promised marriage to my sister while he was already married to another woman. I'm going to challenge him to a duel, Henry exclaimed with hate. It is in your right, sir, and if he died it would be divine justice. But I think that only worsen the scandal and therefore the shame for your family. There is nothing to make a scandal last longer in the memory of society than a duel, especially if it has a fatal outcome. But I guarantee that Thomas's infamy will not go unpunished. From now on he will lack any support from me, he will not see a penny more of my money, and I will expel him from my family. And since he is useless, I am sure that he will die of hunger, to be reduced to the absolute poverty and with the doors of high society closed for him, will be the greatest punishment for that scoundrel, said Mr. Pemberton. What about you, Mr. Pemberton? Do you think that your action of having put that scoundrel in my house does not deserve punishment? The furious Marquis replied. My lord, if you want to punish me by destroying me, ruining my business, I will understand perfectly. I am also the father of 2 daughters and would want revenge if they hurt them. Again I express my request for forgiveness, and as I suppose you do not want me 1 minute more in your house, I have already ordered to pack my things and those of Thomas's scoundrel, and I will leave immediately. With your permission. Mr. Pemberton retired, and when he reunited with his nephew a few minutes later he gave him a strong slap. You have died for me. You will leave my house and you never again will step it. I do not want any contact with you, nor by letter, and you forget about my money because I will not give you a damn penny. From now on you will have to earn. You live alone, and I do not care if you sleep in a dirty alley or under a bridge. You have brought eternal shame to your own family and to this house that welcomed us with open arms. Damn you for the rest of your life. Mr. Pemberton shouted and spat on the ground with contempt. Thomas cried and pleaded, but his uncle turned his back and left. The copyright of this work is reserved by its author.
Efraín Jesús Jorge Acevedo.